It's a beautiful night, isn't it, old friend?
It sure is.
My dear friend, the first story I told you was about a brave man who saved a small creature from a swarm of bees. And to help you sleep well, I will continue to tell you another story about a man who suffered in the mysterious but humane world of the jungle. Comment below to let me know which state of the great United States you are watching the video from, so we can get started. 71 years old with black lung and a dead son. Dennis figured he knew what the rest of his life looked like. Then something in the mountains needed the one thing he had left, his stubborn refusal to quit. Comment the number 1 if you want to hear what happened in those West Virginia hills. Good, here's Dennis's story. The oxygen tank hissed like it had an opinion about everything Dennis did. He'd named it Mary, after his wife, because it nagged just the same, and he couldn't live without it either. The real Mary had been dead 6 years come October. The tank would probably outlast him. That was the joke, except nobody was laughing. Dennis Kowalski woke at 5:30 every morning, because 50 years in the mines had written that time into his bones, and there was no rewriting bones. The alarm didn't matter. His body knew when darkness was supposed to end, even if his lungs had forgotten how to pull a full breath. The cabin sat on 40 acres. His grandfather had bought in 1952 for $800, worth maybe $60,000 now. If anyone wanted to buy mountain land with no cell service and a well that ran sulfur, nobody wanted it. Dennis was okay with that. The property had black walnut trees, older than the interstate, and a creek that still ran clear enough to drink from if you didn't mind the taste of stone and time. He sat at the kitchen table with coffee going cold in a mug that said "World's Best Dad." His son Michael had given it to him in 1997 for Father's Day. Michael had been 14 and still believed his old man hung the moon. That lasted maybe 2 more years before the boy figured out his father was just a man who came home tired and smelling like coal dust and didn't have much to say about anything that mattered. Michael had died in 2012. 30 years old, OxyContin, then heroin when the pills got too expensive, then fentanyl because heroin wasn't reliable anymore and capitalism had come for the drug trade same as everything else. They'd found him in a Walmart parking lot in Beckley at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, sun shining, people walking past with shopping carts. Regular day for everyone except the kid slumped in a Corolla with foam at the corners of his mouth. Dennis had introduced him to the pills. That was the thing he woke up knowing every morning. Back pain, the doctor said. Here's 90 OxyContin. Take as needed. Come back in a month. Dennis had taken them for 6 months until his back felt better, and he still had 40 pills left. Michael had broken his collarbone playing football junior year. Dennis had given him 10 pills, just to help, he'd said, just to get through the worst of it. The worst of it had lasted 18 years and ended in a parking lot. Mary had forgiven him, or said she did, but something in her eyes had changed after the funeral, some light that didn't come back, and she died 4 years later of cancer. That probably would have killed her anyway, but grief had made faster. Dennis knew that. Grief was a mind collapse. It didn't matter if you saw it coming. He pulled the oxygen tube tighter against his face and stood. The cannula left marks on his cheeks now, 2 red grooves like the mountain was trying to erase him one breath at a time. Black lung was poetic in name only. In practice, it was drowning on dry land, 1 degree at a time, lungs turning to stone the way coal had once been trees. The doctor in Charleston had explained it with diagrams. Progressive massive fibrosis. The coal dust he'd breathed for 31 years had settled in his lungs and hardened. Like mixing concrete in there, the doctor said, trying to make it relatable. Dennis had almost laughed. He knew concrete, knew how it set up permanent, knew how nothing could break it except time, and even then it didn't break, it just crumbled slow. 5 years, maybe 7, the doctor said. Depends on how careful you are. Dennis had nodded and left and smoked a Marlboro Red in the parking garage because if he was dying anyway, he might as well die on his own terms. That had been 3 years ago. He figured he had 2 good years left, maybe 4 bad ones. The math didn't matter much. Dead was dead whether it came quick or slow. Outside, November pressed against the windows. Early snow had fallen 2 days before, just enough to make the ground uncertain. Wet leaves underneath, ice on top, the kind of surface that lied about what it was. Dennis pulled on his Carhartt jacket, the brown one, 40 years old, duct tape on one elbow, and grabbed his walking stick. Not because he was old, because the mountain was steep and his lungs were shit, and falling would mean lying there until he could breathe enough to stand, and that was embarrassing, even with no one watching. He wasn't going far, just out to check the back property line, where someone had been cutting trees. Not his trees, but close enough to his land that he wanted to make sure whoever was logging knew where his line was. He'd spray-painted orange marks on the walnut trees that marked the boundary. If they crossed it, he'd call the sheriff. If the sheriff didn't care, and the sheriff usually didn't, Dennis would handle it himself. He was dying, not dead. There was a difference. The cold had teeth. It bit through his jacket, found the spaces between his ribs where the bone showed through more than it used to, settled in his chest like it planned to stay. He could see his breath, could see it was too thin, the way a man's breath should be thick on a morning like this, but his barely made a cloud. Not enough lung left to fog the air properly. That was fine. He didn't need much air for walking. The woods were quiet the way woods get in November. Hunting season was over. Deer had moved to higher ground or deeper hollows. Birds that could leave had left. What remained was bare branches and the particular silence of things waiting for winter to make good on its threats. Dennis had always liked this time of year. After the color was gone, but before the real snow came, the mountains stripped down to what it was, rock and water, and trees that didn't care if anyone was watching. He followed the ridgeline, stepping careful, breathing shallow. The oxygen tank bumped against his hip with each step. Mary the tank. Mary the wife would have told him he was being stupid, going out this far alone with lungs that barely worked. But Mary the wife was in the ground at Sacred Heart Cemetery, and Mary the tank just hissed her steady rhythm and kept him alive whether he wanted it or not. The property line was a 1/4 mile from the cabin. His grandfather had marked it with stones stacked 3 high every 50 feet. Some had fallen over the decades, but enough remained that you could follow them if you knew to look. Dennis had walked this line 100 times, knew every tree, every rock, every place. The ground dropped away sudden enough to break an ankle. That's why he noticed when something was wrong. The ground near the old creek bed had collapsed. Not a little. A sink of mud and water maybe 20 feet across, deep enough that he couldn't see the bottom from where he stood. Recent too. The edges were still raw. Dirt and leaves tumbled in like something had given way fast. Heavy rain last week had probably done it. Or maybe the logging had destabilized something underground. Didn't matter now. What mattered was the sound coming from the pit. Not wind, not water. Something else. Something breathing hard and irregular. The way a man breathes when he's drowning or dying or both. Dennis stepped closer, careful. The way you approach anything that might be dangerous or might need help. Those two things were usually the same. The mud pit opened up in front of him like a mouth. And at the bottom, half submerged, was something that made him stop breathing altogether. It was big. Bigger than a man. Broader across the shoulders than anything had a right to be. Covered in dark, matted hair, thick with mud, arms longer than they should have been, hands that were almost human but not quite. The face, if you could call it that, turned toward him. Eyes met his. Not animal eyes. Not blank or instinctive or empty. Aware, intelligent, frightened. The creature was stuck chest deep. Each movement to pull free only dragged it deeper. The mud had that heavy, wet quality that pulled like hands, that didn't let go once it had you. Dennis had seen men trapped in collapsed mine shafts, seen that same desperate scrabbling that only made things worse. The thing in the pit was dying the same way, slow, struggling, knowing it. He should have left, should have turned around and walked back to his cabin and poured whiskey into his coffee and told himself he'd been seeing things. Black lung messed with your head sometimes. Lack of oxygen made you hallucinate. That's what the doctor had said. Could be he was standing in his kitchen right now, passed out with his face on the table, dreaming the whole thing. Except he knew he wasn't. The cold was too real. The sound of his own breathing through the cannula was too steady. The look in that creature's eyes was too specific to be anything his dying brain could invent. Dennis stood there at the edge of the pit and made a choice. Not because he was brave, not because he was good, but because 31 years in the mines had taught him one thing that stuck even after everything else fell apart. You don't leave a man in the dark. You don't walk away from someone who's trapped. You go back for them, or you die trying, or you live the rest of your life knowing you didn't. He'd left Michael, given him the pills and looked away when the boy started taking too many and told himself it wasn't his business. What a grown man did with his own body. He'd left his son to drown in a Walmart parking lot, and he'd have to carry that until they put him in the ground next to Mary. But he wasn't leaving this, whatever the hell it was. Dennis dropped his walking stick and looked around for something, anything, that might help. There, a fallen branch, maybe 10 feet long, thick enough to hold weight. He dragged it to the edge of the pit and shoved it down toward the creature. "Grab hold," he said. Not sure if the thing could understand English or understand anything, but talking anyway because that's what you did. You talked. You made noise. You let them know they weren't alone. The creature stared at the branch, didn't move. Maybe too weak, maybe didn't understand, maybe didn't trust him. Dennis couldn't blame it for that. He pulled the branch back and looked at the pit again. The edges were unstable. If he went down there, he'd get stuck too. 2 bodies in the mud instead of 1. That didn't help anyone, but the rope in his truck that might work. He'd used it to pull stumps, rated for £1,500. If he could get it around the creature, loop it over something solid, he turned and started back toward the cabin, moving faster than his lungs wanted, the oxygen tank bouncing against his hip. Mary hissing her disapproval. His chest burned. His legs felt like concrete. The cannula wasn't giving him enough air, but he kept walking, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant deciding this was crazy and walking away. The truck was parked behind the cabin, a '98 Ford that started 3 times out of 5 if you prayed right. The rope was in the bed, coiled under a tarp. He grabbed it and headed back, cutting through the woods at an angle that was shorter but steeper. His heart hammered, his vision tunneled. The oxygen tank had maybe an hour left. After that, he'd need to swap it for a fresh one. After that, he'd need to lie down and breathe and accept that he was 71 with lungs full of stone and maybe shouldn't be trying to save monsters from mud pits. But he was already walking, already committed, already halfway back to the pit. When he got there, the creature had sunk deeper. Only its head and shoulders were visible now. The eyes tracked him, watching, waiting. Dennis could see something in that gaze that made his chest tighten. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. Like it knew what he was trying to do and didn't believe it would work, but appreciated the effort anyway. "Hang on," Dennis said. He looped one end of the rope around the trunk of a maple tree, tested the knot twice, then made a larger loop at the other end. The mud pit was maybe 15 feet from the tree. The rope would reach. Barely. He lay on his stomach at the edge. The ground was more stable flat, and lowered the loop toward the creature. "Put your arms through. Like this." He made the motion, not sure if it would understand, but the thing watched him with those eyes that were too intelligent to be an animal's and too desperate to be anything but real. Slowly, God, so slowly it hurt to watch. The creature raised one massive arm. The muscles trembled with effort. Mud streamed off the hair. The hand reached for the loop, missed, tried again, finally caught it. The creature pulled the rope over its head, worked one arm through, then the other. The loop settled around its chest under the arms. Dennis had seen rescue harnesses. This wasn't one. This was just rope and hope, and the chance that pulling might work better than drowning. He stood too fast, stars in his vision, lungs screaming, and grabbed the rope where it stretched back to the tree. The angle was bad. He'd have to pull almost straight up to get the creature out, and straight up meant fighting gravity and mud, and the thing's own weight all at once. He was 71 years old, with black lung, and maybe 160 pounds soaking wet. The creature was probably 400 pounds of muscle and bone, and desperation. This was stupid. This wouldn't work. He should call someone. Except who? The sheriff. And say what? There's a Bigfoot stuck in a mud pit on my property. Bring a crane. They'd commit him. Or laugh. Or both. Dennis wrapped the rope around his hands, planted his feet, and pulled. Nothing. The creature didn't budge. The rope went taut, bit into his palms, but the mud held tight. He adjusted his grip, braced his legs, pulled again. Harder. His back screamed. His lungs forgot how to work. The cannula fell out of his nose, and he couldn't stop to fix it because if he stopped pulling, he'd never start again. The creature shifted. Maybe an inch, maybe less, but it moved. Dennis pulled until his vision went black at the edges. Pulled until he tasted copper. Pulled until the world narrowed to just the rope, and the burning in his chest and the stubborn, stupid refusal to let go. Behind him, in the part of his brain that still worked, he heard Mary's voice. You goddamn idiot. You're gonna kill yourself. Maybe. But he'd already been dying. This was just faster. The creature moved again, 6 inches this time, then a foot. The mud made obscene sucking sounds as it gave up its grip. Dennis's boots slid backward on the leaves. He dug his heels in, pulled, felt something pop in his shoulder, pulled anyway. The creature's chest came free of the mud, then its waist. It was working now too, using its legs to push, arms pulling on the rope, both of them dragging it towards solid ground inch by inch. Dennis's hands were bleeding. He couldn't feel them anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything, except the need to pull one more time, just one more time, and then another after that. And then sudden, shocking, the creature slid over the edge onto the frozen leaves. Dennis let go of the rope and collapsed. His chest heaved. No air coming. The cannula was somewhere on the ground. He groped for it, found it, shoved it back in his nose. Mary the tank hissed her steady flow. Oxygen flooded his lungs. The world came back in pieces. Grey sky, bare branches, frozen ground under his cheek, and 6 feet away, a creature that shouldn't exist, lying in the mud, breathing. They lay there like 2 broken things the mountain had spit out. Dennis on his side, cannula pumping oxygen that felt too thin, too slow. The creature on its stomach, massive chest heaving, mud-caked and trembling. Neither moved. Moving required strength, neither of them had left. Minutes passed. Maybe 5, maybe 20. Time did that thing it does when your body's deciding whether to keep going or just quit. Dennis watched the creature breathe, watched the ribs expand and contract under the matted hair, counted the breaths because counting meant staying conscious, and staying conscious meant staying alive. Finally, the thing stirred. Not much, just a shift of one arm, then the other, pushing itself up to hands and knees. Mud dripped from its body in thick streams. The smell hit Dennis, then earth and musk, and something else. Something wild that had no name in any language he knew. Not unpleasant, just other. Like the smell of the deep mines before they blasted. That particular scent of stone that hadn't seen light in a million years. The creature turned its head, looked at him. Dennis had been looked at by a lot of things in 71 years. Foremen who wanted to know why his crew hadn't met quota. Doctors who wanted to know why he was still smoking. His son, toward the end, with eyes that said, "I know what you did," even when his mouth said nothing at all. But this was different. This gaze had weight, had intention, had something behind it that Dennis recognized from mirrors, from other men who'd survived things they shouldn't have. It was gratitude. Or as close to gratitude as something that big and strange could manage. The creature made a sound, low, deep, coming from somewhere in its chest, not a growl, more like speech that hadn't figured out how to be words yet. The sound had rhythm, had cadence, like language filtered through a throat not built for it. Dennis had heard Afghani soldiers try to speak English once, back when Michael was in high school and the TV was full of that war. They'd known what they wanted to say, but the sounds came out broken, reshaped by mouths that formed consonants differently. This was like that, meaning without translation. "Yeah?" Dennis said. "Because what else do you say? Your welcome seemed stupid. Don't mention it seemed worse. So just, yeah." Acknowledgement that something had happened, and they'd both been there for it. The creature tried to stand, got to one knee, then stopped, shaking. The exertion of climbing out had taken everything it had. Dennis knew that feeling, knew what it was like to push past empty and find out there was nothing underneath, just more empty. And you were running on fumes and spite and the body's dumb refusal to quit when quitting made more sense. He should go, should leave it here to recover and get himself back to the cabin before his oxygen ran out or his heart gave up, or both. That was the smart play. But Dennis hadn't made smart plays in decades. Smart would have been not giving Michael those pills. Smart would have been making Mary see a doctor 6 months sooner. Smart would have been retiring from the mine at 50 instead of staying until they dragged him out with lungs full of coal dust. Instead, he sat up. The world tilted, steadied. His hands were bleeding where the rope had cut through skin. His shoulder felt wrong, not dislocated, but close. His chest burned like someone had filled it with hot ash and told him to breathe it anyway. But he was upright. That counted. "Need to get you away from this pit," he said, talking to it like it was a man, because it looked at him like a man, and that seemed important somehow. "Can you walk?" The creature's eyes stayed on him. Dennis couldn't read the expression, couldn't tell if it understood or was just responding to tone. But after a moment, it pushed itself to its feet. Unsteady, swaying. One hand against a tree for balance. Standing, it was taller than Dennis had guessed. 7 feet easy. Maybe more. Shoulders broad as a doorframe. Arms that reached past its knees. Hands big enough to palm a basketball. Fingers thick and ending in nails that looked more like claws. It could kill him without trying. One swing would snap his neck. One grip would crush his ribs. Dennis was aware of this, the way you're aware of lightning during a storm present. Dangerous, but not something you could do much about, except hope it passed you by. But the creature didn't swing, didn't grab, just stood there breathing hard, looking at the man who'd pulled it from the mud, maybe trying to figure out what the hell species would do that. Dennis pointed toward his cabin. "That way. You can rest. Get cleaned up some." He started walking, slow, giving the thing time to decide whether to follow. His boots crunched on frozen leaves. The oxygen tank hissed. Behind him, heavier footsteps, uneven, stumbling. But following, the walk back took twice as long as it should have. Dennis had to stop every 50 feet to breathe. The creature had to stop every 20 to stay upright. They made a pair, the old man with lungs full of stone and the monster with legs full of mud. Two things the mountain had tried to kill that were too stubborn to lie down yet. When the cabin came into view, Dennis felt something in his chest ease. Not relief exactly, more like the acknowledgement that he'd made it this far and could probably make it the rest of the way. Probably. His vision was starting to tunnel again. The oxygen tank was down to fumes. He needed to get inside, swap tanks, sit down before he fell down. He glanced back. The creature had stopped at the tree line, wouldn't come closer. Made sense. A thing that size that smart had learned to be careful around human structures. Buildings meant people. People meant guns. Guns meant dead. Simple math. Survivor's calculus. "Wait here," Dennis said. He went inside, moving on autopilot, unhook the empty tank, hook up the full one, twist the valve, check the flow. Oxygen flooded his nose, cold and metallic, and necessary. He closed his eyes, leaned against the kitchen counter, waited for his lungs to remember their job. When he could think again, he filled a pot with water from the tap, found the first aid kit under the sink 30 years old. Half the supplies expired, but the bandages would still work. grabbed bread, cheese, the end of a ham. Wasn't sure what the thing ate. Figured it couldn't hurt to offer. He carried it all outside. The creature was still there, sitting now with its back against an oak tree, watching the cabin the way you'd watch something that might explode. Wary, ready to run. Dennis set the pot down, the food, the bandages. Stepped back. Best I got. Don't know what you need, but there it is. The creature didn't move. Dennis stood there feeling stupid, bringing sandwiches to a Bigfoot, like he was feeding a stray dog, like any of this made sense. But then the thing reached out, slow, and picked up the water pot, lifted it with both hands, drank deep, water spilling down the hair on its chest, mixing with the mud, running in clean rivulets. When it finished, it set the pot down careful, like it knew what breaking things meant. Then it reached for the bread, ate it in 3 bites. Then the cheese. The ham disappeared in seconds. Dennis watched and felt something he hadn't felt in years useful, like his presence in the world had shifted the balance of something, even just a little. The creature looked at him again, made that sound deep, resonant, almost words. Its hand moved to its chest, then gestured toward Dennis. The meaning was clear enough. Thank you, or I see you, or you saved me, and I won't forget. Dennis nodded. Don't mention it. He went back inside, exhausted to his bones, and stood at the kitchen window watching. The creature sat under the tree for an hour, maybe more, resting, breathing, existing in the space between almost dead and alive enough to leave. Dennis knew that space, had been living in it for 3 years. When the sun started its drop behind the western ridge, the creature stood. Slower this time, but steadier. It looked toward the cabin once more. Dennis raised his hand, not waving, not beckoning, just acknowledging. The creature turned and walked into the woods. Branches swallowed it. Within seconds, there was no sign it had ever been there, except mud on the leaves and an empty pot, and the knowledge in Dennis's chest that the world was bigger than anyone had told him. He sat at the kitchen table with whiskey in his coffee, and his hands shaking delayed shock, the body finally allowed to fall apart now that the crisis was over. His shoulder throbbed, his palms were torn up, his lungs felt like someone had taken a cheese grater to them from the inside. But he'd done it, pulled something from the mud, saved it. For the first time since Michael died, Dennis had done something that mattered, something that couldn't be undone or regretted or second-guessed into failure. He drank his coffee and didn't think about anything at all. The creature didn't come back that night, or the next. Dennis told himself that was fine, expected. The thing was wild, belonged in the mountains, had probably moved on to wherever it came from. That's what made sense. That's what happened when you helped wild things they left. That was the natural order, except he kept looking. Couldn't help it. Walking the property line, checking the tree where it had rested, scanning the woods for movement. Nothing. Just November pressing into December, the days getting shorter, the cold getting teeth, and Dennis alone like he'd been before. He went to town Tuesday for supplies. The Walmart in Beckley, same one where Michael died, but it was the only store for 30 miles, so you went anyway, and pretended the parking lot was just a parking lot. He bought oxygen tanks, frozen dinners, whiskey. The checkout girl was maybe 19, looked at him like he was invisible. Old man, dying man, ghost already except still breathing. On the way back, he stopped at Sacred Heart Cemetery. Hadn't been in a month. The graves didn't need visiting. Mary and Michael were gone, not living under headstones waiting for company. But Dennis went anyway, because not going felt like forgetting, and forgetting felt like erasing. And they'd been real, they'd been his, and someone should remember. Mary's stone was simple. Mary Catherine Kowalski, 1940, 7 to 2018. Beloved wife and mother. Nothing about the cancer, nothing about the grief that had probably killed her faster than tumors. Just dates and a title that didn't capture anything about who she'd been, how she'd laughed at stupid jokes, how she'd kept the books for his grandfather's farm before they sold it, how she'd stood by him through 31 years of coal dust and union fights and coming home too tired to be the husband she deserved. Michael Stone was worse. Mikhail Dennis Kowalski, 1980, 2 to 2012, gone too soon. Like too soon meant anything. Like there was a right time for a son to die of fentanyl in a Walmart parking lot. Dennis had wanted it to say something true. Here lies the boy, I killed by giving him pills. But the funeral director had looked at him like he was crazy, and Mary had been too broken to fight about it. So they'd gone with the lie. Dennis stood between the graves and didn't pray, didn't talk to them. They weren't there to hear him. But he thought about the creature in the mud pit, about the choice to pull or walk away, about how he'd walked away from Michael 1,000 times, seen the signs, seen the pills disappearing faster than they should, seen the boy's eyes go glassy and wrong, and told himself it wasn't his business, wasn't his fault, wasn't his responsibility to fix. He'd walked away, and his son had drowned, but he hadn't walked away from the creature. That had to mean something. Didn't fix anything, didn't bring Michael back, didn't make Mary's last years less full of grief. But it meant that maybe, at the end, when they tallied what kind of man he'd been, there'd be one mark on the other side of the ledger. One thing he'd done right. He drove home in silence, the truck's heater broken, his breath fogging the windshield. The next morning he found tracks, big ones, in the snow that had fallen overnight, pressed deep into the ground behind the cabin. They led from the woods to the back porch, then stopped, like something had walked up, looked in the window, then left. Dennis followed the tracks with his eyes. They went back into the trees, disappearing into the deep woods where the hemlock grew thick enough to black out the sky. On the porch, arranged carefully, was a pile of wood, split logs, stacked neat, enough to burn for a week. Dennis stared at it. He hadn't split wood in 2 years, couldn't anymore. The axe too heavy, his lungs too weak. He bought his firewood from a guy in town, paid too much for it. But what choice did he have? Now he had a week's worth, split perfect, stacked like someone who knew what they were doing. He touched the top log, still cold. The creature must have brought them before dawn, when the world was dark and no one would see. Payment maybe, or thanks, or just the acknowledgement that debts mattered, even between species that couldn't speak the same language. Dennis looked toward the woods. Nothing moved, but he felt watched, felt presence. Like the trees had eyes and they were all turned his direction. Appreciate it, he said to the empty air. The wind moved through bare branches. Could have been answer, could have been just wind. Thursday, the creature left more wood. Friday, vegetables from somewhere. Carrots, potatoes, still dirty from the ground. Saturday, a rabbit already cleaned and gutted, hung from a nail on the porch post. Dennis cooked it that night, the meat tender, and sat at his table eating something killed by hands that weren't human and feeling less alone than he had in 6 years. This became the pattern. The creature brought gifts. Dennis left water, food, sometimes just sat on the porch in case it wanted company. They didn't speak, couldn't, really. One of them lacking language and the other lacking the throat to make those deep, resonant sounds, but they communicated anyway. The old way, the way people had before words complicated everything. Winter came down hard the week before Christmas. Not the pretty kind with fat flakes and pine trees looking like postcards. The mean kind, ice that made the roads impassable and the power lines snap and the cold so deep it got inside your bones and wouldn't leave. Dennis burned through the wood the creature brought faster than it could replenish. Burned it and still woke shivering. The cabin's insulation 40 years past doing its job. His breathing got worse. The cold squeezed his lungs like fists. Every breath was a negotiation his body barely won. He went through oxygen tanks twice as fast. Had to drive to town for refills, even though the roads were hell, and the truck's heater was still broken, and by the time he got home, his hands were so numb he couldn't feel them enough to hook up the new tank. The creature must have noticed, must have seen him struggling, watched through windows, or from the tree line where it spent its time. Because 3 days into the cold snap, Dennis woke to find his porch enclosed. Not well, not professionally, but enclosed. Someone had nailed boards across the open sides, rough lumber that didn't quite fit, but blocked the wind, had hung a tarp over the top to keep snow off, had even packed mud and moss into the gaps to seal it. The porch had become a room, drafty, unfinished, but warmer than exposed air. Inside the new space sat more wood than Dennis had seen in months, a mountain of split logs stacked floor to ceiling, enough to burn until spring, if spring ever came. Dennis stood in his doorway in his long underwear and his cannula and his disbelief. He'd watched the porch yesterday. It had been open. Now it wasn't. The creature had done this in one night. Hours of work in darkness and cold, building shelter for a dying man who couldn't build it himself. Jesus Christ, Dennis said to the frozen morning. From the woods, that sound, deep, resonant, almost words. He turned and saw it just for a moment, standing in the hemlock shadow, watching, making sure he understood. Then it was gone, branches swallowing it, and Dennis was alone again, except he wasn't really alone anymore. He started leaving better food. Canned soup heated on the stove, bread he bought fresh instead of day-old. He couldn't afford it. His disability check barely covered oxygen and whiskey, but he did it anyway, because debt went both ways. Because the thing in the woods was keeping him alive, and alive meant something again. The creature started coming closer, not inside, never inside, but to the porch edge. Dennis would sit in his chair, the enclosed space holding heat from the wood stove, and the creature would sit on the ground, just outside, back against the cabin wall. They'd exist there in silence, sometimes an hour, sometimes more. Dennis would drink coffee. The creature would breathe that deep, steady rhythm that sounded like the mountain itself exhaling. Once, Dennis reached out, slowly, hand extended toward that massive shoulder, asking permission without words. The creature went still, then, carefully, leaned in. Let the old man's torn-up hand rest against dark hair matted with pine sap and dirt, and the smell of places humans didn't go. The hair was coarser than Dennis expected, thick, warm underneath despite the cold. He could feel the muscle beneath, the solidness of a body built for survival in ways his own had never been. The creature's breathing didn't change, just accepted the touch, allowed it, trusted. Dennis pulled his hand back after a moment. Some things you didn't push. You got a family, he asked, knowing there'd be no answer he could understand. Someone out there worried about you? The creature made a sound, lower this time, sadder. If sadness could exist in frequencies below human speech, it looked toward the mountains, toward the high places where the trees grew too thick for roads. Something in that gaze made Dennis think yes. Yes, there was family. Yes, someone was waiting, but the creature was here instead, sitting with a dying coal miner, and that meant something had happened. Some separation, some loss. Yeah, Dennis said. I get that. They sat in silence until the cold became too much, even for the creature's thick hide, and it stood and walked back into the trees, and Dennis went inside to lie down, because sitting upright had become work his body didn't want to do anymore. The doctor called that afternoon. Dennis let it go to voicemail, listened to it later. Appointment missed, need to reschedule, concerned about lung function decline, please call back. He deleted it. He knew his lung function, knew it was declining. New appointments meant sitting in waiting rooms with fluorescent lights and old magazines, and eventually a doctor saying what he already knew. Getting worse, getting closer. Maybe 6 months now instead of 2 years. 6 months meant March. Mud season, the world turning soft and uncertain before it hardened into spring. He'd probably make it that far. Probably not much further. The thought didn't bother him the way it used to. When Mary first died, when Michael was already gone and Dennis was alone, dying had seemed like the only thing left that made sense. Natural conclusion, closing the book. But now there was the creature. Now there was wood on the porch, and vegetables, and the knowledge that something in the world needed him, not for much, just for company. Just for the acknowledgement that two broken things could sit together and be less broken for it. That mattered. That meant he couldn't just give up and lie down and wait for his lungs to quit. Not yet. Not while something was still coming to his porch. On New Year's Eve, not that Dennis was tracking, but the calendar on the wall said, December 31, the creature brought something different. Not food, not wood, a branch. Cedar, fresh cut, still green, about 2 feet long. Someone had woven it with grass in a pattern Dennis didn't recognize. Spiral, maybe. Or circles. Hard to tell. It laid the branch on the porch boards and stepped back, waiting. Dennis picked it up. The cedar smell was strong, clean, the kind of scent that cut through winter and made you remember summer. The weaving was intricate, deliberate, not accidental, not decorative. It meant something in a language Dennis didn't speak. This important? He asked. The creature made that sound the one that felt like speech. Its hand moved to its chest, then gestured toward Dennis, then toward the mountains. Dennis understood, or thought he did. Gift, connection, invitation, maybe, or just acknowledgement that they'd become something to each other. Whatever that something was. Thank you, Dennis said. The creature, Saturday. Dennis Saturday. They watched the sun go down together, the sky going purple and then black, the stars coming out cold and distant, and not caring about either of them. When midnight came, not that they could tell, but it came anyway. Dennis raised his coffee mug. To another year, he said, knowing he probably wouldn't see another, saying it anyway. The creature made its sound. Could have been agreement, could have been goodbye, could have been both. January brought clarity the way winter does. Everything stripped to essentials. Survive or don't. Breathe or stop. Keep going or quit. Dennis kept going because the creature kept coming, and he'd be damned if he'd let it find him dead on the porch one morning. That felt like betrayal, like walking away. He'd done that once, wasn't doing it again. But his body had other plans. The coughing got worse. Not regular coughing. Deep, tearing coughs that brought up blood and left him gasping on the floor, waiting for oxygen to remember how to work. The pain in his chest became constant. Sharp when he breathed deep, dull when he breathed shallow. His appetite disappeared. Food tasted like ash. He forced himself to eat anyway: canned soup, bread, whatever the creature brought, because starving to death seemed stupid when he'd made it this far. The creature noticed, started bringing different things. Roots that looked medicinal, bark he was supposed to chew, maybe. Dennis tried them. Didn't help, couldn't help. You didn't cure black lung with forest medicine. You just waited until the stone in your lungs weighed more than your will to breathe. One morning he couldn't get out of bed. Tried. Got his legs over the side, pushed himself up, and the world went sideways. He hit the floor hard enough to knock the cannula loose. Lay there breathing shallow, waiting for strength that wasn't coming. From outside, a sound. The creature at the door. Not knocking, it didn't have that fine motor control, but scratching, pushing, concerned in the way things get when they know something's wrong but can't fix it. I'm okay, Dennis called. His voice came out whisper thin. Just need a minute. But minutes became an hour, became 2. The creature's sounds grew more urgent. Dennis heard it moving around the cabin, trying windows, trying the back door. He kept locked. Finally, he heard wood crack. The creature had broken through the porch boards. Heavy footsteps. Then it was inside. First time, in 6 weeks of this strange friendship, it had never come inside. But it was here now, filling the bedroom doorway, massive and dark, and radiating something Dennis couldn't name. Not threat, something else. Determination, maybe. Or refusal to watch him die alone on the floor. It crossed the room in 2 steps. Crouched. The smell hit Dennis, musk and earth and winter, and then those massive hands were lifting him, careful as you'd lift an infant. The creature carried him to the bed, laid him down gentle, pulled the blanket up, found the cannula, and worked it back into Dennis's nose, with fingers too big for the task, but trying anyway. Dennis, looked up into that face. Not human, would never be human, but not animal either. Something between. Something that understood mortality and compassion and the weight of watching someone fade. "Thanks," Dennis whispered. The creature sat on the floor beside the bed. Too big for the chair, too big for the room, really, but making itself small anyway. Keeping vigil, like it knew Dennis was close to the end and wasn't going to let him cross that line alone. They stayed like that. Hours. Dennis drifting in and out. The creature breathing steady, a rhythm Dennis could time his own breaths to. The mountain outside pressed against the windows. The cold pressed against the walls. Inside, two things that shouldn't exist together existed anyway. Dennis woke to pale light. Morning, though which morning he didn't know. The creature was still there, had moved to the doorway, sitting with its back to the frame, watching both the room and the cabin beyond. Guard and companion both. "You should go," Dennis said. "Got your own life, your own people." The creature's head turned. Those eyes found his. "I'm dying," Dennis said, stating fact. No emotion in it, just truth. "Probably got days now, maybe a week. You don't want to be here for that." "It's not." He coughed, blood on his lips. "It's not pretty." The creature made its sound. Lower than usual, it moved back to the bedside. One massive hand reached out, hovered over Dennis's chest, then pulled back, like it wanted to help, like it knew it couldn't. Like that helplessness was a language both of them spoke fluently. Dennis closed his eyes. "When I go," he said, "there's no one coming, no family to call, no funeral to plan. The county'll take the body eventually. Maybe, if they notice." He breathed, shallow. "But I got a favor to ask." The creature waited. "The cedar branch, the one you brought, it's in the kitchen, on the table." Dennis opened his eyes. "When I'm gone, take it back. Wherever it came from. Let them know." He stopped. Let them know what? That an old coal miner died, that a human had cared, that the world had one less breath in it. Let them know it mattered. This, you, all of it. The creature's eyes held his. Then it nodded. Once, deliberate, a promise made. Dennis felt something in his chest ease. Not the pain, that was staying, but the weight. The fear of dying alone in a cabin, with no one to mark the moment. The creature would know, would witness, would carry something of him back to wherever it came from. That was enough. That was more than he'd expected from these last years. He slept. When he woke again, it was dark. The creature was gone. Dennis lay in bed, feeling his lungs work less and less, feeling the stone inside him growing heavier. He thought about Michael, about the pills, about Mary in the ground, about 31 years breathing coal dust to feed a family that had disappeared one by one until there was nothing left but him and a mortgage paid off, and this cabin that would belong to the county soon. He thought about the creature in the mud pit, about the choice to pull or walk away. He'd pulled. At the end, when it counted, he'd pulled. That was worth something. Maybe the only thing. The door opened. The creature was back, carrying something. It moved to the bedside and held it out the cedar branch. Dennis had told it to take it after. But it was here now, offering it. "Not yet," Dennis whispered. The creature shook its head. Not offering, showing. It pointed to the branch, then to Dennis, then to itself. Then it made gestures, hands moving in patterns that Dennis couldn't follow, but felt he understood anyway. Story, history, connection. The branch meant more than gift. It meant something in the creature's world, something important. It was saying goodbye. Not because Dennis was dying, because the creature was leaving. "You have to go," Dennis said, understanding settling in. "Back to your people." The creature nodded, made it sound sad, certain, inevitable. "They need you more than I do." Another nod. Dennis reached out. The creature took his hand, or let Dennis take its hand. The difference didn't matter. They held on, old man and old myth. Two things the world was trying to forget, trying to erase. trying to let slip away into the dark. "Thank you," Dennis said, "for the wood, for the company, for not letting me die thinking I was alone in all this." The creature squeezed. Gentle, careful, then let go. It stood, walked to the door, turned back once. Dennis raised his hand, not waving, just acknowledging. The creature made its sound one last time, deep, resonant, carrying something Dennis felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. Then it was gone. Dennis lay in the dark and listened to the wind. His breathing was so shallow now, so thin. The oxygen tank hissed, but it wasn't helping anymore. Nothing was helping. The stone in his lungs had won. He'd known it would eventually. Everything ends. Mountains erode, trees fall, men die. That was the deal. But he'd pulled something from the mud. He'd kept it alive. He'd sat with it through winter and learned that the world was stranger and bigger and more full of wonder than anyone had told him. That was worth dying for. That was worth the years of pain and grief and slow suffocation. He closed his eyes. The cabin settled around him. The mountain pressed close. The cold had teeth, but it didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except the knowledge that he'd done one thing right. One thing that couldn't be undone or regretted. He'd saved something, and it had saved him back. Sometime in the night, he didn't know when Dennis Kowalski stopped breathing. The oxygen tank kept hissing for another hour before it ran empty. The wind kept blowing. The snow kept falling. The world kept turning the way it does. Indifferent, relentless, marking time by seasons instead of heartbeats. They found him 3 weeks later. The county came because the mailbox was full, because someone at the post office remembered an old man who picked up disability checks and hadn't been in, because even people who want to be forgotten get noticed. Eventually, when they stop existing, the sheriff's deputy was young, maybe 25, hadn't been born when Dennis went into the mines. Knocked on the door, got no answer. Walked around back. The porch had boards nailed across it that looked recent. Fresh wood. Inside, through the window, he could see a shape on the bed. The door was unlocked. Dennis lay under his blanket, cannula still in his nose, oxygen tank long empty. Peaceful, if you could call death peaceful. The deputy had seen enough bodies to know this one had been gone a while. Cold got in through the walls and slowed decay, but the smell was there. Faint, unmistakable. He called it in. Made his report. Natural causes, looked like. No signs of struggle. Old man, lived alone, had black lung according to the medical alert bracelet. This was expected. This was how men like Dennis Kowalski ended alone in cabins in winter, bodies discovered by strangers who'd never known their names. The deputy walked through the house taking notes. Kitchen clean. Firewood stacked neat on the porch. More wood than one old man could have split, but maybe he'd bought it. Living room sparse. Photographs on the mantel. Woman who must have been his wife. Boy who must have been his son. Both dead too, probably. That's usually how it went. On the kitchen table, a cedar branch, woven with grass in a pattern the deputy didn't recognize. He picked it up, turned it over. Some kind of craft project, maybe, or just something the old man had found in the woods. He set it back down. Strange thing was the vegetables. Root cellar was full of them. Carrots, potatoes, turnips, all fresh. Someone had been bringing food, but there were no tire tracks in the snow except the deputy's cruiser. No footprints leading to the house except his own. He wrote it up as unusual but not suspicious. Old guys in the mountains knew how to preserve food, knew how to live on nothing. Probably had everything he needed before winter hit. The coroner came, took the body. The county would handle burial, no family listed, no will on file. Sacred Heart Cemetery had plots for indigents. Dennis would go there, next to strangers, away from his wife and son because those plots were in the family section, and family meant someone had to claim you. No one claimed him. Before they locked up the cabin, the deputy took one more walk through, making sure nothing valuable got left behind. In the bedroom, he found something odd. The floor had marks, Deep impressions in the wood, too big for furniture, too far apart. Like something massive had sat there for a long time. He looked at the marks, looked at the bed, tried to imagine what could have made them. Couldn't. He locked the door and left. The cabin sat empty, snow piled against the walls. The enclosed porch held its wood through February, through March. When spring came, the boards warped, the tarp tore, weather got in, the wood rotted. Nobody bought the property. It went to auction, failed to sell, reverted to the county. Eventually someone would clear it, build something new, or let the mountain take it back. The way the mountain took everything if you gave it enough time. But sometimes, hikers on the ridge trail report something strange. Stacks of stones that weren't there before. 3 high, running in a line through the trees. Like a boundary marker. Like someone was maintaining something. When rangers investigate, they find nothing. Just stones. Just forest. And sometimes, very rarely, hunters tell stories. About finding split wood in clearings where no one lives. About vegetables left at the edges of their camps. About hearing sounds in the night, deep, resonant, almost like speech. They laugh when they tell it. Say it was probably bears, probably wind, probably nothing. But they don't go back to those clearings. The cedar branch disappeared from the cabin before the county locked it. The deputy would swear later he'd left it on the table. But when the estate sale people came through, it wasn't there. Just an empty table and dust, and the smell of a life that had ended alone. Or maybe not alone. In the deep woods, where the hemlock grows thick enough to black out the sun, there are places people don't go. Places the trails avoid. Places that feel watched. The trees there are old. The silence is older. And sometimes, if you're very quiet, if you're very still, you can hear breathing that isn't wind, rhythm that isn't thunder, presence that isn't nothing. The creature went back to its people. Or it didn't. Or it did, and brought something with it, a story about a dying man who pulled instead of walking away, about debt repaid, about winter survived, about 2 things that shouldn't have mattered to each other but did anyway. Maybe they marked it. Maybe they built something in the mountains to remember. Or maybe they understood what Dennis understood, that some things don't need marking. They just need witnessing. They just need to have happened. The world is bigger than they tell you. Stranger. More full of things that exist in the spaces between known and unknown. More full of connections that don't make sense on paper, but make perfect sense when you're sitting on a porch in winter with someone who doesn't speak your language, but understands your silences. Dennis Kowalski died alone in a cabin in West Virginia. That's what the death certificate says. That's what the records show. But the wood's no different. A knowledge like that, it doesn't die with one man. It doesn't get buried in Potter's Field. It gets carried, gets remembered, gets passed down. In whatever language creatures use when they speak of humans who chose kindness over fear. Some nights, if you're up in those mountains, you might see them. Shadows moving through trees, too big to be deer, too deliberate to be tricks of light. You might hear sounds that aren't quite speech, but aren't quite animal either. You might find offerings, wood, food, stones, stacked in patterns, and wonder who left them and why. You might stand at the edge of the forest and feel watched by something that doesn't want to hurt you, just wants you to know it's there, that it exists, that the world has room for more than what you've been told. And if you're very lucky, very quiet, very still, you might understand that the watching isn't threat, it's gratitude, it's memory. It's the acknowledgement that once, in winter, a dying man did something that mattered. The tracks in the snow lead away toward the high places. They always do. And they never quite fade, even when spring comes and the ground goes soft and the world pretends nothing walks there but wind. The measure of a soul is how it answers the knock. Dennis answered. That's all. That's everything. The woods don't explain, but they remember. And remembering, sometimes, is all the salvation any of us get. So that's Dennis's story. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think in the comments. More next Friday.